The first thing I noticed wasn't the eviction notice. It was the watch. An old silver watch with a cracked crystal and a faded leather strap, hanging from the wrist of a man who looked as though he had never been late a single day in his life. His black Rolls-Royce stopped in front of my little white house just after 9 on a bright Saturday morning. 3 attorneys stepped out behind him. 2 security guards remained by the gate. Construction vehicles waited farther down Maple Street, their engines already running. The neighborhood watched from behind lace curtains. They weren't watching because an old widow might lose her home. They were watching because everyone knew this house was the last one standing. If I left, everything else would disappear with it. The man walked onto my porch without removing his sunglasses. My name is Mark Harrison. He placed a thick folder on the little table beside my rocking chair. You have 24 hours to vacate the property. The demolition permit becomes effective tomorrow morning. His voice wasn't cruel. It was worse. It was practiced. Like he delivered difficult news so many times that he no longer heard the weight of his own words. I looked at the folder. Then at the old silver watch. Finally, I looked into his eyes. They never told you about the watch, did they? He frowned. I'm sorry. I smiled gently. They told you what your father owned. They forgot to tell you what he promised. His expression hardened. My father built Harrison Development. I've spent 20 years protecting what he left behind. I slowly shook my head. No, Mark. You've spent 20 years protecting what he built. You've never been told why he built it. For just a moment. He didn't answer. Something in his face shifted. Not belief. Not doubt. Only curiosity. And sometimes, curiosity is all the truth needs. When I was a young wife, I believed the hardest part of growing older would be losing the people I loved. I was wrong. The hardest part has been watching beautiful stories slowly become smaller every time they're retold. A sacrifice becomes a business deal. A friendship becomes a partnership. A promise becomes a contract. Standing on that porch, looking at Thomas Harrison's son, I realized he hadn't inherited his father's heartlessness. He had inherited an unfinished story. And unfinished stories have a quiet way of asking to be completed. Mark glanced down at the watch. Almost unconsciously. His thumb brushed the cracked crystal. You seem very interested in this old thing. I am. I helped your father wind it every Sunday for almost 20 years. He stared at me. My father hated watches. He always said they were impractical. I couldn't help smiling. No. He hated wasting time. The watch reminded him not to. The wind stirred the maple tree beside my porch. Its branches stretched over the sidewalk exactly as Henry had always imagined they would. He used to say, "Nobody plants a tree for themselves. They plant it for someone they'll never meet." Mark looked toward the tree. Then back at me. I don't have time for riddles, Mrs. Gable. I have investors waiting. I nodded. I know. Your father once said the very same thing. Silence. Long enough for the birds to be heard again. Long enough for the construction workers to stop pretending they weren't listening. Then I reached beneath the small table and lifted an old framed photograph. 2 young men stood shoulder to shoulder beneath a tiny maple sapling. One was my husband, Henry Gable. The other was Thomas Harrison. Both were covered in sawdust. Both were laughing. Mark slowly removed his sunglasses. For the first time, he looked less like a developer and more like a son. I've never seen that photograph before. No. I answered softly. You were never supposed to. Until the day you came to tear down the promise they built together. The construction crews didn't move. Not yet. No one gave the order. Mark stood on my porch, still holding the old photograph. His eyes moved back and forth between the smiling young man and the picture. and the face of the father he thought he had known. Finally, he looked up. "Where did you get this?" "It has always been here." I gently took the frame from his hands and turned it over. The back was covered with faded handwriting. Thomas Henry. Maple Street. April 1983. The day we made our promise. Mark read the words twice. His expression tightened. My father never mentioned this. No. He rarely spoke about the things that mattered most. Behind us, one of the foremen walked toward the porch. "Mr. Harrison? We're ready." All Mark had to do was nod. One small movement. One simple decision. Instead, he kept looking at the photograph. Then at the watch. Then back at me. 5 minutes. The foreman hesitated. "Sir?" I said 5 minutes. The man quietly stepped away. The bulldozers fell silent once more. The neighborhood noticed. Curtains shifted. Front doors opened. People who had spent weeks packing their memories stopped what they were doing. Hope is a strange thing. It rarely arrives with applause. More often, it enters quietly through the smallest hesitation, a conversation that lasts 5 minutes longer than expected, a question finally asked, or a heart that becomes just curious enough to delay making a decision it cannot take back. Mark slipped the photograph into the folder without realizing he had done it. "I need proof." "I understand." "I wouldn't believe me either." I walked inside the house. A moment later, I returned carrying a small wooden box. Its oak surface was worn smooth from decades of careful hands. I placed it on the porch between us. "I've never opened this." Mark looked surprised. "You've had it all these years?" "It wasn't mine to open. Henry asked me to wait." "For what?" I smiled. "For the day Thomas's son came wearing that watch." His eyes immediately dropped to his wrist. The cracked silver watch suddenly felt heavier than before. "You knew I'd wear it?" "No. Henry did." Mark almost laughed. "That's impossible. Henry passed away years ago." "So did your father." I answered gently. "And yet, both of them seemed to be standing between us this morning." Neither of us spoke. The breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass through the neighborhood. Children's bicycles still leaned against front porches. Wind chimes softly echoed somewhere down the street. It was the kind of ordinary morning Henry had loved most. Mark finally looked at the wooden box. "What if I don't open it?" "Then nothing changes." "And if I do?" I looked toward the maple tree. "Then you'll spend the rest of your life wishing you'd opened it sooner." For the first time since arriving, he removed the watch from his wrist. He turned it over, running his thumb across the cracked back cover. Something caught his attention. Tiny letters. Almost invisible after years of wear. He held it closer to the sunlight. 6 words. "Never forget the promise." His breathing slowed. "I've worn this watch since my father died." I never noticed that. I nodded softly. Some things only become visible when we're finally ready to see them. Just then, a dark Lincoln sedan turned slowly onto Maple Street. It stopped behind the line of construction vehicles. An older gentleman stepped out carrying a weathered leather briefcase. The moment I saw him, I smiled. Good. He's right on time. Mark looked at me. Who is he? The gentleman walked calmly toward the porch. He removed his hat. Extended his hand. My name is Charles Whitmore. I represented your father's private trust for 31 years. Mark frowned. My father didn't have a private trust. Charles met his eyes without the slightest hint of argument. He hoped you would never need to know it existed. Then Charles rested his weathered briefcase beside the wooden box. and quietly said the words that made the color leave Mark's face. Your father left instructions for this exact morning. More than 3 decades ago. Charles placed the weathered leather briefcase on my porch. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he looked at the old silver watch in Mark's hand. Then he smiled. So, you kept it. Mark frowned. You knew about this watch too? Charles nodded. I watched your father wind it almost every Sunday. Mark looked genuinely confused. My father hated sentimental things. A soft laugh escaped Charles. No. He hated showing sentiment. Those are very different things. The neighborhood had become strangely quiet. Construction workers leaned against their trucks. Neighbors stood silently along their front porches. No one interrupted. Somehow, everyone sensed this morning had stopped being about a house. Charles slowly opened the briefcase. Inside were only 3 things. A thick leather binder. A sealed envelope. And a small brass key. Nothing else. No stacks of legal papers. No property deeds. No financial records. Mark looked disappointed. This is what stopped an entire construction project. Charles answered calmly. No. Your father's choices stopped it. I'm simply here to explain them. Mark folded his arms. My father built Harrison Development from nothing. Charles looked directly into his eyes. No. He rebuilt his life from nothing. Those are not the same story. For the first time, Mark didn't interrupt. He simply listened. I've lived long enough to discover that every family quietly edits its own history. We polish the victories. We shorten the failures. We turn complicated people into simple heroes. Looking back now, I don't think Thomas ever meant to hide the truth from his son. I think he simply waited too long for the perfect moment. And life has a painful habit of ending before perfect moments ever arrive. Charles opened the leather binder. The very first page wasn't a contract. It wasn't a trust agreement. It was a newspaper clipping. Warehouse worker rescued from downtown fire. Dated October 1978. The faded photograph showed firefighters carrying a young man wrapped in a blanket. Mark stared at the picture. His face slowly lost its color. That's my father. Charles nodded. 28 years old. Married. Terrified. Mark turned the clipping over. On the back, his father had written one sentence. I owed my future to a man who asked for nothing in return. Mark swallowed hard. My father never told me this. No. Charles said quietly. He wanted you to admire the life he built. He should have told you who made it possible. Charles carefully lifted another photograph from the binder. This one had never appeared in any newspaper. Henry sat in a hospital bed. His left arm was wrapped in heavy bandages. Thomas sat beside him. Head lowered. Looking more like a younger brother than a businessman. They took this 3 days after the fire. Charles said. Henry went back inside. Your father didn't. Mark looked at me. You knew? I was sitting beside Henry when that picture was taken. He smiled the entire afternoon. Mark whispered. Why? Because Thomas survived. Silence settled over the porch. Even the wind seemed to soften. Charles reached into the binder one final time. He removed a folded sheet of notebook paper. Not typed. Not notarized. Handwritten. Across the front. Thomas Harrison had written. Read this only if my son ever mistakes ownership for gratitude. Mark hesitated. His fingers rested on the edge of the paper. What is this? Charles answered gently. The first confession your father ever wrote. Mark slowly unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakable. My dear son. If you're reading this, then somewhere along the way, I failed to tell you the most important story of my life. You believe I became successful because I worked harder than everyone else. That isn't true. I became successful because one ordinary man refused to let me die. Mark's eyes stopped moving. The paper trembled in his hands. He whispered, "Henry." Charles nodded. "Now, I think you're finally ready to understand why your father never replaced that broken watch. And why he spent 31 years hoping this day would never come." Mark couldn't finish the letter. His voice simply stopped. The words remained on the page. But something inside him had begun to shift. He lowered the paper. "My father. He never told me any of this." Charles answered quietly. "No. He believed there would always be another Sunday." No one spoke. The construction equipment remained parked along Maple Street. The engines had long since been turned off. What had begun as a demolition had quietly become a family reckoning. Mark looked at the old silver watch again. "So that's why he kept it." Charles gently shook his head. "Not yet. You're only seeing half the story." Mark frowned. "What do you mean?" Charles carefully reached into the binder again. This time, he removed a small cassette tape. Its white label had yellowed with age. Across the front, Thomas had written only 5 words. "Only if I fail, Henry." Mark looked confused. "A cassette? My father recorded something?" Charles smiled sadly. "No. Henry did." Mark looked at me. "You've heard it?" I slowly shook my head. "Never. Henry asked all of us to wait. Even me." Charles nodded. "He made us promise." The tape could only be played after Thomas was gone. And only if his son came here wearing that watch. Mark instinctively tightened his grip around the watch. "You mean he knew this would happen?" Charles paused before answering. "No. He prayed it never would. But Henry believed that if this day ever arrived, anger would never change your heart. Only truth could. There is a quiet difference between preparing for someone's failure and believing they will fail. The people who love us most don't spend their lives expecting the worst from us. They simply leave lights on in case we lose our way home." Looking back now, I think that's what Henry had really been building all those years. Not a legal plan. Not a clever surprise. Just a path that could still lead one lost son back to the father who loved him. Charles carefully placed the cassette player on the porch table. No one reached for it. Not yet. Instead, he opened the sealed envelope that had rested beneath the tape. Inside was a single sheet of lined notebook paper. Thomas's handwriting. Much shakier than before. Mark recognized it immediately. "My dear son. If you're standing on Eleanor's porch today, then I have already failed in one important way. Not because you came to remove her home, but because you believed it was ever yours to take." Mark closed his eyes. The words struck harder than any accusation. Charles continued reading. "I spent years teaching you how to negotiate. How to lead. How to win. Henry spent those same years trying to teach me something much harder. That every piece of land eventually belongs to someone else. But every act of kindness belongs to eternity." Mark slowly sat down in Henry's old rocking chair. For the first time since arriving, he looked exhausted. Not from work. From understanding. He whispered, "I don't know who my father was anymore." I sat down across from him. "You've just met the part of him he was most proud of." A long silence passed between us. The maple leaves rustled overhead. A robin landed on the porch railing. Somewhere down the street, a child laughed. Life continued as though nothing extraordinary was happening. Perhaps because the most important moments rarely announce themselves. They happen quietly. Inside ordinary conversations. Inside old letters. Inside truths that arrive years later than they should. Charles finally looked at the cassette player. I believe. It's time. He slid the tape into the recorder. His finger rested on the play button. Then he looked directly at Mark. Before you hear Henry's voice, there's one question your father asked me to ask you. Mark slowly nodded. Charles spoke gently. If this tape proves your father spent his entire life protecting a promise, what are you prepared to do with the one he has just placed in your hands? Charles rested his finger on the play button. No one moved. The entire porch had become impossibly still. Even the construction workers who had gathered near the sidewalk seemed to understand that whatever came next belonged to a different kind of courtroom. One built not on law, but on memory. Charles looked at Mark one last time. Are you ready? Mark drew a slow breath. I don't know. Charles gave a gentle smile. Neither did your father. He pressed play. A soft hiss filled the old recorder. Then, a warm laugh echoed through the tiny speaker. Well, if you're hearing this, I suppose Thomas finally ran out of Sundays. The words carried no bitterness. Only affection. Henry continued. Hello, Mark. I wish we were meeting over coffee instead of through an old cassette. But life doesn't always let us choose the timing. Mark lowered his eyes. His fingers tightened around the silver watch. I've been thinking about what to say to you for many years. I tried writing letters. I threw them away. I thought about asking Thomas to explain everything. He always said, next Sunday. Henry chuckled softly. We both believed we'd have one more Sunday. The laugh faded. His voice became quieter. If there's one thing age finally taught me, it's that love should never be postponed until life becomes convenient. I closed my eyes. Even after all these years, Henry still sounded exactly like himself. Calm. Patient. Never in a hurry. As the years have passed, I've learned that regret rarely comes from the harsh words we spoke. More often, it comes from the gentle words we kept saving for another day. Looking back now, I think Henry understood something I didn't until much later. Time doesn't steal the people we love all at once. It quietly takes away the chances we thought would always be waiting for us. Perhaps that's why kindness feels so urgent when we finally understand how few ordinary Sundays any of us are promised. Henry took another slow breath. Mark. I hope you know something before you hear the rest. I never blamed your father. He made mistakes. So did I. The difference is, we spent the rest of our lives trying to deserve each other's forgiveness. A long pause followed. Then Henry began telling the story Mark had never heard. The fire happened on a Thursday. Your father had gone back inside for payroll records. I went after him. Not because he owed me anything. Not because I was brave. I simply couldn't imagine telling your mother that I watched her husband disappear while I stood outside. Mark covered his mouth. Henry continued. When they carried us out, I remember looking at Thomas. He kept apologizing. Over and over. I finally told him, if you're going to spend the rest of your life thanking me, then thank me by becoming the kind of man who never lets anyone stand alone. Charles quietly wiped his glasses. Even he had never heard Henry's voice in years. I wasn't asking him to repay a debt. I was asking him to continue a habit. That's all kindness really is. A habit. One person begins it. Another person keeps it alive. The cassette clicked softly. For a moment, everyone thought the recording had ended. Then Henry laughed one more time. Oh. And Mark. If you're wearing that old watch, turn it over. Mark frowned. He slowly flipped the watch into his palm. Inside the worn back cover, hidden beneath decades of scratches. He noticed something he had never seen before. Not an engraving. Not initials. A tiny folded piece of paper. His hands began to tremble. Charles looked just as surprised. I didn't know that was there. Neither did I. Carefully, Mark unfolded the tiny note. Only one sentence had been written in Thomas Harrison's unmistakable handwriting. One day, when you finally understand why Henry saved me, you'll also understand why this neighborhood was never mine to sell. The tiny note rested in Mark's trembling hands. He read it again. And then a third time. One day, when you finally understand why Henry saved me, you'll also understand why this neighborhood was never mine to sell. No one spoke. The words carried a strange kind of weight. Not because they answered every question, but because they opened a much larger one. Mark slowly looked toward Maple Street. The children riding bicycles. The old maple tree. The front porches where generations had watched life unfold. Then he whispered. My father wasn't talking about ownership. I nodded. No. He was talking about stewardship. Charles smiled quietly. That's the word he used most. Never owner. Always steward. Mark leaned back in Henry's rocking chair. For the first time that morning, he stopped looking like a man trying to defend a decision. He looked like someone mourning a father he had only just begun to know. Charles reached into the leather binder one more time. There is one document left. Mark managed a tired smile. I was wondering when we'd get to the lawyer's papers. Charles chuckled. You'll be disappointed. He unfolded a single yellow legal pad. No signatures. No official seals. Just Thomas's handwriting. Across the top he had written. What I hope Mark learns before I die. Mark's breathing slowed. Charles handed him the page. I think your father wanted you to read this one yourself. Mark began reading aloud. I hope my son never measures success by how much land he controls. I hope he measures it by how many people feel safer because he showed up. His voice cracked. He continued. I hope one day he understands why Henry refused every gift I offered. Henry said gratitude that can be bought was never gratitude at all. Mark stopped reading. His eyes filled. He whispered. I've spent my whole career trying to prove I deserved everything my father built. I looked gently at him. And today, you're finally asking whether you deserve the trust he carried. As I've grown older, I've stopped believing that people become wiser simply because the years pass. I've met young people with old souls, and old people who never learned how to listen. What changes us isn't age. It's the moment we become humble enough to admit that someone else's story might matter as much as our own. Watching Mark that morning, I wasn't seeing a wealthy executive lose an argument. I was watching a son quietly lay down the version of his father he had carried for years, so he could finally meet the real man beneath it. Mark folded the page carefully. Almost reverently. I don't know how to fix this. No. I answered. You don't. You don't fix 40 years in one morning. You begin. Charles looked toward the construction crews waiting down the street. They're still expecting your instructions. Mark followed his gaze. The bulldozers remained parked. The operators stood outside their machines. Waiting. Not impatiently. Simply waiting. Mark stood. He walked slowly down the porch steps. Every eye on Maple Street followed him. The foreman met him halfway. Mr. Harrison? We're ready whenever you are. Mark looked beyond him. Past the heavy equipment. Past the survey stakes. Past the orange barriers. He saw things he hadn't noticed yesterday. A little girl drawing chalk flowers on the sidewalk. An elderly veteran raising the American flag. A young father repairing a loose mailbox. Ordinary moments. The very moments his father and Henry had spent decades protecting. Mark turned back to the foreman. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Shut everything down. The foreman blinked. For today? Mark slowly shook his head. No. For good. A wave of silence moved through the neighborhood. No cheers. No applause. Just disbelief. Then, Mrs. Alvarez quietly stepped onto her porch. She placed her hand over her heart. Across the street, Mr. Jenkins removed his cap. The construction workers lowered their heads. Charles smiled without saying a word. I simply looked toward the maple tree. Some promises don't end with signatures. Sometimes they begin with 4 simple words. For good. And somewhere inside the quiet ticking of an old silver watch, it almost felt as though 2 old friends were smiling together once again. The construction crews packed their equipment in complete silence. No engines roared back to life. No one complained. The orange barricades disappeared one by one. By late afternoon, Maple Street looked almost exactly as it had the day before. Except for one thing. People had stepped outside again. Children rode bicycles between the sidewalks. Mrs. Alvarez watered her roses. Mr. Jenkins repaired his front gate. 4 weeks. Everyone had been preparing to leave. Now, no one seemed quite sure what tomorrow looked like. Mark remained on my porch long after everyone else had gone home. The expensive suit jacket that had looked so imposing that morning now rested across the back of Henry's old rocking chair. His tie had disappeared somewhere. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows. For the first time, he looked less like the CEO of Harrison Development, and more like Thomas's son. I canceled everything. He stared across the quiet street. I thought I'd feel relieved. Instead, I feel ashamed. I handed him another cup of coffee. Shame only becomes useful when it teaches us where to begin. He nodded slowly. I don't know these people. No. You only knew the land beneath their houses. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass across the porch. Mark looked down at the folded list Charles had taken from the binder earlier. 27 addresses. 27 families. Beside each name, Thomas had written one small sentence. Mrs. Alvarez never celebrates her birthday alone. Mr. Jenkins pretends he doesn't need help carrying groceries. The Wilson twins dream bigger than this neighborhood. Every note revealed something deeply personal. Every note proved Thomas had never stopped walking these streets. When I was younger, I thought people became part of a community simply because they lived on the same street. It took me many years to understand that neighborhoods are built much more quietly than that. They're built every time someone remembers your favorite pie, notices your empty porch light, or knocks on your door without needing a reason. Looking at Thomas's handwritten notes, I realized he had spent decades leaving behind a map that couldn't be found on paper. It was a map of people. And perhaps that's the only one that ever truly matters. Mark carefully folded the list again. My father knew every one of them. He tried to. I smiled. He forgot birthdays sometimes. He burned more hamburgers than anyone I've ever known. He couldn't sing. But he always showed up. Mark laughed softly. I've spent years trying to become successful. You already are. I answered. The harder question is, who feels safer because you succeeded? The words settled gently between us. No accusation. Only an invitation. Just then, Charles walked back onto the porch carrying another small package wrapped in brown paper. I almost forgot. Mark looked surprised. There's more? Charles smiled. Not from your father. He handed the package to me. The return address is Henry's workshop. I slowly untied the old string. Inside rested a worn leather notebook. No title. No dates. Only Henry's initials pressed into the cover. I opened the first page. There were no journal entries. Only a handwritten heading. People worth visiting this Sunday. Beneath it, hundreds of names. Some crossed out after they had passed away. Many still familiar. At the very bottom of the final page, one name had been added in different handwriting. Mark Harrison. Beside it, Henry had written only one sentence. He'll come when he's ready. Mark stared at those 6 words. His eyes filled again. I never even met him properly. I gently closed the notebook. No. But somehow, he never stopped believing one day you would find your way here. Mark looked toward the maple tree. The old silver watch rested quietly in his hand. For the first time, he wasn't wondering what his father had left him. He was wondering whose name belonged on Henry's list next Sunday. The next morning, Mark came back alone. No attorneys. No executives. No polished black sedan. Just an old pickup truck borrowed from one of the maintenance crews. It looked completely out of place beside the elegant homes at the entrance to Maple Street. So did he. His sleeves were rolled up. The expensive shoes were gone. He wore worn leather work boots instead. When Mrs. Alvarez opened her front door, she almost didn't recognize him. I thought you'd forgotten us already. Mark smiled. I've spent 20 years forgetting. I'm hoping to spend whatever time I have left remembering. He unfolded Henry's notebook. People worth visiting this Sunday. The first name was already waiting. Mrs. Elena Alvarez. Favorite pie, lemon meringue. Never lets anyone leave hungry. Mark laughed quietly. Henry really wrote this? I nodded. He believed people deserved to be remembered for joyful things. Mrs. Alvarez disappeared inside. A minute later, she returned carrying 2 slices of lemon pie. I suppose Henry wins again. Mark accepted the plate with both hands. Not because of the pie. Because for the first time, someone on Maple Street was treating him like a neighbor instead of an enemy. By noon, he had visited 7 homes. At each one, he discovered another story his father had never shared. Mr. Jenkins showed him the birdhouse Henry had rebuilt after a storm. Mrs. Collins pointed to a cracked sidewalk. Thomas came every spring to fix that. The Wilson twins proudly showed him the oak tree Henry planted with their grandfather 20 years earlier. None of it appeared in annual reports. None of it increased property values. Yet somehow, it explained the neighborhood far better than any survey map ever could. Around mid-afternoon, Mark arrived at the little white house carrying Henry's notebook. He looked exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. I've met 12 families. He sat quietly on the porch steps. My father knew all of them. I smiled. He knew their stories. That's different from knowing their names. Mark slowly nodded. I think I finally understand. No. I answered gently. I think you've finally started. There comes a season in life when we stop asking whether people respect us, and begin wondering whether they feel safe with us. I didn't understand that when I was young. I thought love was proven through grand gestures. Henry taught me otherwise. He believed trust was built in teaspoons, not buckets. A repaired fence. A birthday remembered. A porch visit after someone lost a loved one. Watching Mark walk from house to house that day, I realized he wasn't trying to earn forgiveness anymore. He was learning the slower, quieter work of becoming trustworthy. Mark reached into his pocket. He unfolded the handwritten list Thomas had left behind. 12 names now carried small pencil check marks. I don't want this to end. It won't. I looked toward the maple tree. It only ends when you stop showing up. Just then, Charles pulled into the driveway. He stepped out carrying something wrapped in an old wool blanket. I found this in Henry's workshop. Carefully. He placed it on the porch. Mark gently unfolded the blanket. Inside was a beautifully restored wooden bench. Simple. Handmade. Its oak surface had been polished until it glowed in the afternoon sunlight. A small brass plaque had been fastened beneath the seat. Henry Gable and Thomas Harrison. For the Sundays we were given. Mark ran his fingers across the engraved words. Then he noticed something else. The bench had only 3 legs. He looked up, puzzled. It's missing one. Charles smiled. No. It isn't missing. He reached into the back of his truck. Slowly. He carried over the 4th leg. Still unfinished. Still rough. Taped to it was one final handwritten note from Henry. I thought Mark might like to finish this part himself. The unfinished table leg rested across Mark's lap. It wasn't polished. It wasn't stained. Henry had left it exactly as it had come from the workshop. Rough. Honest. Waiting. Mark turned it over in his hands. A pencil line still marked where the final cut should have been made. He really expected me to finish this? Charles smiled. Not because he knew you would. Because he hoped one day you'd want to. Mark carried the leg into Henry's old workshop behind the house. The room smelled of cedar, machine oil, and sawdust. Nothing had changed. Henry's workbench remained exactly where he'd left it. His favorite hand plane rested beside an old wooden mallet. Even his coffee mug still sat on the corner shelf. The words printed across it had almost faded away. Measure twice. Be kind 3 times. Mark smiled through watery eyes. That sounds like him. It was. I answered. He never rushed either woodworking or people. Charles quietly placed Henry's notebook on the bench. Inside the cover. Another folded page slipped onto the floor. None of us had noticed it before. Mark bent down and picked it up. Across the top. Henry had written. If Mark ever finishes the bench. He unfolded the page carefully. My dear Mark. If you're standing in this workshop, then you've already done something that matters much more than fixing furniture. You came back. Mark swallowed hard. Henry's words continued. Most people think redemption arrives all at once. It doesn't. It usually arrives disguised as another ordinary morning. When someone quietly decides not to quit. Mark looked around the workshop. Every shelf held unfinished projects. Half-carved toys. Cabinet doors waiting for hinges. Picture frames missing glass. He frowned. Henry never finished these. I smiled. Oh, he did. They simply belong to someone else now. As I've grown older, I've discovered that unfinished things no longer make me uncomfortable. When I was young, I believed every story needed a perfect ending and every project deserved a polished finish. Henry gently taught me otherwise. Sometimes leaving a little work for someone else isn't failure at all. Sometimes it's an invitation. It's a quiet way of saying, I believe there will still be someone here after I'm gone. Looking around that workshop, I realized Henry hadn't left behind unfinished furniture. He had left behind opportunities for love to continue through other hands. Mark unfolded the rest of the letter. I left the 4th leg unfinished on purpose. Not because I doubted your ability. But because I wanted you to discover something. A bench doesn't stand because one leg is stronger than the others. It stands because every piece carries its share. So do families. So do neighborhoods. So do promises. Mark rested the unfinished leg against the workbench. I spent years believing leadership meant standing above everyone else. Charles quietly replied. Henry believed leadership meant kneeling beside someone who couldn't finish the work alone. The workshop fell silent. Outside. Children laughed beneath the maple tree. A dog barked somewhere down the street. The ordinary sounds of life drifted through the open window. Mark picked up Henry's old hand plane. He carefully smoothed the rough edge. One slow pass. Then another. He wasn't trying to work quickly. He was trying to work well. An hour later. The fourth leg finally fit perfectly beneath the bench. Not flawless. Not machine perfect. Human. Henry would have liked that. Mark stepped back. It's finished. I gently shook my head. No. It's ready. Charles looked toward the front yard. Ready for what? I smiled. For its first Sunday. Just then. A little boy riding his bicycle stopped outside the workshop. He looked at the newly completed bench. Is that for sale? Mark laughed. No. The little boy tilted his head. Then who gets to sit on it? Mark looked toward the maple tree. Then at Henry's notebook. Then back at the child. He smiled in a way that sounded remarkably like Thomas. I think. It belongs to anyone who needs someone to sit beside them. The first Sunday gathering happened 1 week later. No invitations were mailed. No advertisements were printed. No speeches were scheduled. People simply arrived. Mrs. Alvarez carried 2 peach pies. Mr. Jenkins brought a toolbox because he said, something always needs fixing. The Wilson twins arrived with folding chairs. Children raced beneath the maple tree, their laughter replacing the sound of bulldozers that had echoed there only days before. Mark carried the finished bench himself. He refused every offer of help. I should be the one to put it back. Together, we placed it beneath the old maple tree. The bronze plaque caught the morning sunlight. Henry Gable and Thomas Harrison. For the Sundays we were given. No one applauded. Instead, everyone quietly took a step closer. The silence carried more respect than applause ever could. Charles stood beside Mark. You know. Your father never wanted anyone to notice the bench. He said if people remembered the friendship instead of the furniture, then it had served its purpose. Mark smiled. I think I finally understand him. Charles gently shook his head. I think. You're finally beginning to. Just then, a black SUV pulled onto Maple Street. Several members of Harrison Development's board stepped out. 2 investors followed. The same executives who had approved the demolition plans only a week earlier. One of them approached Mark. We've been looking everywhere for you. The board meeting starts in an hour. The redevelopment proposal still needs your signature. Mark looked at the folder. He didn't even open it. Instead, he pointed toward the families gathered beneath the tree. What do you see? The executive looked confused. I see homeowners. Mark smiled softly. I see shareholders. The man frowned. They don't own company stock. No. Mark replied. They invested something much harder to earn. They trusted us. There was a time in my life when I believed trust could be rebuilt with explanations. Age has taught me something gentler. Trust rarely returns because we find the perfect words. It returns because someone quietly keeps showing up long after the apology has been spoken. Watching Mark stand beneath that maple tree, I realized he wasn't trying to convince anyone that he had changed. He was allowing his choices to speak before his voice ever needed to. One of the board members stepped forward. If we cancel this project, our quarterly earnings will suffer. Mark nodded. They probably will. And the shareholders? They deserve honesty. The executive sighed. So what's your plan? Mark looked around the neighborhood. Children chasing bubbles. Neighbors sharing homemade food. An elderly couple sitting together on Henry's bench. Then he answered. We're changing the project. He opened the folder for the first time. Not to sign it. To remove every demolition drawing. He handed them back. We're restoring every home that families want to keep. We're replacing sidewalks. Repairing roofs. Planting more trees. Creating grants so long-time residents can remain here. One investor stared at him. That's not the most profitable option. Mark smiled. My father spent years teaching me how to build profitable developments. Henry spent one afternoon teaching him why. The board members exchanged uncertain glances. Then something unexpected happened. The youngest director quietly closed her own folder. My grandparents raised me 3 blocks from here. She looked around at the neighborhood. I think we've been measuring success the wrong way. One by one. The others lowered their folders. No dramatic vote. No emotional speeches. Just a quiet decision. The kind Henry always believed lasted the longest. As everyone prepared lunch beneath the maple tree, Charles walked over holding the old silver watch. He placed it carefully into Mark's hand. The steady ticking continued. Then Charles smiled. There's one final place your father wanted you to wear it. Mark looked up. Where? Charles glanced toward the little white house. No. He said quietly. Not the house. The place where your father's promise truly began. He pointed beyond Maple Street. Toward an abandoned brick warehouse at the edge of town. The very building where Henry had once carried Thomas out of the fire. The following afternoon, Mark stood in front of the abandoned brick warehouse. The building had been empty for years. Its broken windows reflected the bright spring sky. Wildflowers had begun growing through the cracks in the old loading dock. Nature had been quietly healing a place people had long ago forgotten. Charles unlocked the rusted chain around the front gate. I haven't been here since your father passed. Mark looked at the weathered brick walls. This is where it happened? Charles nodded. October of 1978. The fire started near the storage room. Your father went back inside. Henry followed him. For several moments. No one moved. The warehouse no longer looked frightening. It looked ordinary. Almost disappointingly ordinary. Mark whispered. It's strange. I imagined the place that changed my father's life would somehow feel different. I smiled gently. Most sacred places do. They rarely announce themselves. They simply become sacred because love once chose to stay there. We walked slowly through the empty building. Sunlight streamed through the broken skylights, painting bright rectangles across the dusty concrete floor. Near the center of the warehouse, Charles stopped. He pointed toward a faded steel support column. Your father was trapped there. Mark stood quietly. No dramatic music. No applause. Only silence. He slowly placed his hand against the cool steel. Then he closed his eyes. For the first time. He wasn't imagining the successful businessman Thomas Harrison had become. He was imagining a frightened young husband who thought he might never see his family again. I've often wondered why certain places continue to move us long after the people connected to them are gone. I don't think it's because the buildings remember us. I think it's because our hearts quietly remember who we were before life became complicated. Standing inside that old warehouse, I wasn't remembering the fire anymore. I was remembering 2 young men who believed that another person's life was always worth more than their own comfort. Some memories don't ask us to look backward. They gently invite us to become better moving forward. Charles opened the small wooden box he had carried from the car. Inside rested a bronze plaque. Simple. Elegant. No corporate logo. No family crest. Only a few engraved words. On this site, in October 1978. Henry Gable chose courage. Thomas Harrison chose gratitude. May all who stand here remember that a life is never changed by success alone, but by the kindness that makes success possible. Mark read the inscription slowly. When he finished, he looked toward me. "I'd like to place it here." I nodded. So would Henry. Together, the three of us mounted the plaque on the old brick wall. No photographers were there. No reporters. No ribbon-cutting ceremony. Only 3 people. Keeping a promise that had waited nearly half a century. As Mark tightened the final screw, the old silver watch quietly ticked beneath his sleeve. Tick. 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 He smiled. Not with pride. With gratitude. Charles stepped beside him. "There's one final envelope." Mark laughed softly. I wondered if we'd reached the end. Charles handed him a small cream-colored envelope. Across the front, in Thomas's familiar handwriting, were 8 simple words. "Open only after you've returned to where I began." Mark carefully broke the seal. Inside, there wasn't a legal document. There wasn't another confession. There was only one handwritten sentence. "My son, if you came back here of your own free will, then I know I didn't fail after all." The first Sunday of summer arrived beneath a sky so clear it almost looked painted. The maple tree cast a wide circle of shade across the little park. Children laughed as they chased one another through the grass. Neighbors carried folding chairs without asking where to place them. Some traditions don't need invitations. They simply find their way home. The bench Henry and Mark had finished together now stood beneath the oldest branch of the tree. Its oak had already begun to soften beneath sunlight and rain. People used it exactly as Henry had hoped. Not as a monument. As a place to rest. Mrs. Alvarez shared peach pie with a family who had just moved onto Maple Street. Mr. Jenkins showed 2 teenagers how to repair a loose fence. No one talked about demolition anymore. The neighborhood no longer remembered the day it almost disappeared. It remembered the day someone chose to stay. Mark arrived carrying only a small toolbox. The old silver watch rested comfortably on his wrist. Still ticking. Not loudly. Just faithfully. Like a promise that no longer needed to prove itself. He walked over to me with a smile. "I met the new family on Elm Street yesterday. They're expecting their first baby." I smiled. "So you've already started your own Sunday list?" He laughed. "I guess I have." Then he reached into his jacket pocket. Carefully, he unfolded a worn sheet of paper. It was Thomas's old list. 27 names. Every family had a small check mark beside it. Beneath the last name, Mark had added 4 more. Then 5. Then 6. The list was growing again. Not because Henry had left instructions. Because kindness has a quiet way of continuing once someone decides to practice it. As I've grown older, I've stopped wondering whether the people I loved left me enough. They did. More than enough. What I've begun wondering instead is whether I've been faithful with what they entrusted to me. Henry never left me a fortune. Thomas never left Mark the perfect answers. They left something much more fragile. A habit of showing up. A promise quietly renewed. Looking around Maple Street that afternoon, I realized the greatest inheritance isn't something we keep. It's something we continue. And perhaps that's why love outlives every one of us. It never asks to be owned. Only carried a little farther by the next pair of willing hands. A little boy wandered over to the bench. He looked at the bronze plaque. Then up at Mark. "Mr. Who were Henry Gable and Thomas Harrison?" Mark looked toward the maple tree. Toward the little white house. Toward the families laughing together beneath the afternoon sun. He smiled before answering. "They were 2 friends. They taught me that a neighborhood isn't built with lumber. It's built every time someone decides another person's home matters as much as their own." The little boy thought about that for a moment. Then he nodded. "My grandpa says neighbors are like family you don't have to be born into." Mark smiled. "Your grandpa sounds like a wise man." The little boy grinned and ran back toward the playground. The sound of children laughing drifted through the warm afternoon air. Charles quietly joined me beneath the maple tree. Neither of us said anything for a while. We simply watched. The old silver watch continued its gentle rhythm. Tick. 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 Not counting down. Not measuring deadlines. Simply reminding one grateful sun that every ordinary Sunday was another chance to keep an old promise alive. And as the sunlight filtered through branches planted by hands that knew they might never enjoy their shade, I found myself smiling. Not because Henry's story had ended. Not because Thomas's promise had finally been fulfilled. But because somewhere between an old photograph, a cracked silver watch, and one quiet decision to listen, two good men had taught another how to become one.